All right, so this is page 2 that talks about disability documentation requirements. This is the next step of information to know in the process to make sure you give me the right information. First off, please keep in mind that students are responsible for gathering and sending their clinical documentation. So make sure that you're the one who looks and finds and gets that. SAGU won't do that for you, okay? So this is any documentation that was created by a professional to when they evaluated and tested you in order to diagnose as well as provide the details of your disability so we could better understand how it affects you. The first and most important part of this is that your documentation answer these following questions, okay? So first of all, it needs to answer who made the diagnosis as well as what was diagnosed. Along with that, it needs to answer how was the disability assessed and was the assessment appropriate. There will not be a direct statement that speaks to this. I'll just be looking for some specific tests that match the diagnosis that was given to make sure that it was measured correctly. Third, what are the results of those tests and what's their interpretation? That is something that's specifically explained in the report that you'll be giving me as part of the documentation. Following this, next question is what symptoms are experienced and how severe are they? This just provides some more information to help me better understand how you are impacted by that disability. What accommodations are recommended? That's many reports will do this. They'll list the accommodations that they suggest based on what they see is going on. Other reports may say how the disability limits the student in the academic environment. There are some reports that do both. I need to have the report say at least one of these. This helps provide direction in selecting the appropriate accommodations for you. And the final question is, what are the students' strengths? What are the students' current coping techniques as well for responding to these diagnoses? So the idea is not just understanding the challenges and the troubles of being a student, but also areas that you are strong, different skills and stuff that you use that do work, as well as coping techniques you've learned or developed yourself that you use that are supportive in your academics. This will help me also better find the right accommodations that match those skills and those strengths. Instead of just choosing something generic, I might be able to more personalize the accommodation that's given to match what you already do and where you're already strong. Okay, so these are the questions that the documentation needs to answer. All of these reports, this documentation, need to also be on official letterhead. That would be from the clinic or from the school district or wherever it has originated from. We need it to be on official letterhead. It also needs to contain the professional's credentials who did your assessment, as well as their physical signature showing that they're signing off on this report. Another element that you could have everything else up here done, but if it's not this final part, if it's too old, then that document is no longer explaining or describing you within a recent time frame, and we need that to be as accurate as we can. So if there are neurocognitive tests that are involved in this in your documentation, they aren't allowed to be more than 3 years old. Many of the other tests that cover, and another part of that too, they can't be more than 3 years old, and they also need to have covered the thought process domains that are listed below. If they don't have those thought processes, they need to at least explain why. So we're looking for complex attention, executive function, learning and memory, language, perceptual motor, and social cognition. Now, it may be that some tests don't include this at all, and that's fine. But if those tests do include this usually, then we need to have the scores for those. If not, again, an explanation. Any tests that aren't considered neurocognitive tests, but are intelligence tests or achievement or aptitude tests, or there may be clinical tests or personality tests, behavioral tests, etc. Those other types of tests, they can't be more than 5 years old. Okay, so that's what we're looking for is the qualifications. Next are just a list of some of the typical ones that many students come to SAGU with. First is one that's called a full and independent evaluation. It's called an FIE in Texas. Other states may call it an independent educational evaluation, or IEE. They both do the same thing. They provide diagnosis, psychological or cognitive assessment results, and evaluations, and they are from school districts. So if you've gotten your testing through school districts, they should have this report available. They don't usually provide it to the parents up front, but if it's requested from them, they will provide it. So you may need to directly request for them to provide the full and independent evaluation, or the IEE. All right, another type of documentation may be called a psychoeducational evaluation. Many times it's the same type of tests that are provided in the full and independent evaluations, but these are usually paid for by parents, so they don't call it the same thing. Make sure that if you're about to go get tested with a psychoeducational evaluation, that they are doing in-depth tests, not the screens. So they're doing these in-depth thought processes. They're not just testing, for example, your reading level, but they're testing the different elements of reading specifically themselves. They break reading down in different parts and they test each of those parts. That's what we're looking for, not just the overall general subject area. Another type of documentation may be psychological or psychiatric evaluation in diagnosis reports. These, as well as just like the ones up here, they need to be supported with testing results. And that were administered by qualified professionals, which is again why we need to have the credentials here as well. So as long as that's there, that should be fine. In some cases, a physician's letter is appropriate. Most cases, not necessarily, but if the physician who is diagnosing the disorder or disability is qualified, then that's fine. So for example, if a student has epilepsy, then a qualified neurologist or physician who's got training in that would be able to provide a physician's letter and with explanation of these things that we need up here at the top that would answer these same questions up here at the top. Okay, so no matter what type of documentation you're getting, you need to make sure that it's answering these questions here. All right. Now, there are other types of documentation that on their own are not helpful, but these documents are helpful along with these other documents that are up here. So they don't contain all that we need, but they provide some more information. For example, an individualized education plan, or IEP, that lists accommodations and other information. The 504 committee plan report is helpful, just like the IEP. It lists the accommodations used, which is wonderful. It shows a history of accommodations, and that's a big part of what we need. But there was tests that were done for each of these to be written. We need those tests as well. Even for a 504, if the test is older than 5 years, or an IEP, it doesn't hurt to send those, and that might be helpful as well. Okay, the final thing that might be provided is something that's called an exit ARD report. ARD stands for Admission Review and Dismissal. This is for special education students, their last meeting about special education before they graduate from high school. Some states call it a Summary of Performance, or SOP. Either way, we need the most recent one. Exit ARD is going to be the most recent one. They also provide more information about interventions and accommodations and performance that are really helpful in knowing what's going on. So these are supplementary additional documentation that will help along with these first kinds too. And this ends the page about documentation requirements.